This program was first broadcast on Canterbury's access media station, Plains FM, and was made with the assistance of New Zealand On Air.
Now it's time for Spiritual Learning with Priestess Lilly.
Welcome to my radio show. Priestess Lilly, Sacred Heart Healer, Space Holder, and Spiritual Life Coach. Hi, I'm Priestess Lilly. Welcome. This radio show podcast I have created to help assist humanity rise the consciousness through connection, holding space for thought-activating conversation with heart-centered leaders, wisdom keepers, and divine humans expanding into their authenticity and soul purpose. Today's guest, David, is a photographer, painter, singer, and lecturer who resides in the town of Kaiapoi, just north of Christchurch, New Zealand. Originally from London, David is predominantly known in New Zealand for his work and study of UFOs, a path that is opened to him over 35 years while serving in the New Zealand Navy. In this scenario, the ship he served on had a close encounter with a USO, an unidentified submerged object, out of the Pacific. An experience that left a profound effect on David and ultimately his direction in his life, which has been one of self-discovery, personal development, and research. For many years now, David has been researching into the city of Atlantis. He now regularly lectures on this subject, a lecture which is insightful and informative presentation explaining both scientifically and spiritually the history of the purpose of Atlantis, and has the webpage Atlantis is Rising. Welcome, David. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, David. I am absolutely fascinated in you and your work. And I've just found out we're just down the road, so we might be able to meet up for a cuppa.
Oh, that would be lovely, yes.
So tell me a little bit about you, how this work, how you were guided to this work of Atlantis Rising. And yeah, I'm absolutely intrigued.
Well, firstly, Lily, good morning. Thank you for having me on your show. It's lovely to connect to like-minded individuals. It's such a humbling experience to meet people from all over, even though, you say you're up the road from me, but it doesn't matter anymore because we connect globally this way, and it just feels so lovely. So thank you for the opportunity. My story really starts as a child because my parents got involved with TM, or Transcendental Meditation, with the Maharishi back in 1973. And of course, TM was made famous by the Beatles, who in 1968 became involved with the Maharishi, went to his ashram in India, and made it sort of globally acceptable to do this thing called meditation, which hadn't been seen in Western society. So when the Maharishi brought TM into the UK, because that's where I'm from, London originally, my parents and other friends jumped into the organization instantly. In fact, my mother became the first administration person for the center that opened up in central London. And our home became sort of a meeting place for TM members. And so I was a youngster at that time, but my experiences at that time were of potluck dinners, meditation nights, people dressed very interestingly, wearing, saris and fezzes and kaftans and very hippie-like and beads. And it was a wonderful environment to be brought up in. And as the years went by, the organization held ashrams, which would be normally the hiring of a stately home in England, and thousands would flock, and my parents would be part of that. So I was brought up in a very spiritual background, which is interesting because I was also brought up in the Jewish religion, being Jewish. So we also went to Sunday school as children, my older sister and I. And so there was this interesting conflict of feelings and knowledge, because on one hand, I'm being brought up in a spiritual environment with universal consciousness understandings, meditation, gurus, enlightenment, and then going to Sunday school and it's about God and the Old Testament and blah, blah, blah. And nothing wrong with either of those, by the way. But it came to a point when I was getting ready to be bar mitzvahed, which is when a young boy at 13 is transitioning in the Jewish religion to being a man. It's called a bar mitzvah. And I was being trained for my bar mitzvah, but then the rabbi of our synagogue brought my parents in for a meeting and said, look, you have to make a choice. You need to choose whether you're going to follow God or follow your guru. And whichever choice you make is going to determine how, the progression of David's bar mitzvah. And my parents chose to follow a guru. So we had to leave the synagogue congregation because that's where their passions lay and that's where their beliefs lay. Mm-hmm. I wasn't too unhappy because I was really finding it difficult to learn the bar mitzvah, so I was okay with that. And so I really followed my parents into the world of personal development. And then in 1983, we all emigrated to Sydney, Australia, where they met up with old friends from the TM days who had started up a new personal development organization called ST, or Self Transformations. And my parents became teachers. They brought the organization to New Zealand in 1984 and set it up in Auckland, and it became a huge national organization. And we're talking every weekend they'd be teaching a minimum of 120 people on a workshop every weekend. And from those workshops came many of today's great Reiki masters, musicians, practitioners of some sort. They all started back in those early 1980s workshops that my parents were teaching. And they didn't just teach one style of workshop. They taught life, death, and reincarnation, relationships, sexuality. There was outward bounds, challenging workshops and so forth. And I did every single one of them. So my parents, for quite some time, became my teachers, which was a really interesting place to be, especially when you're dealing with childhood hurts of the past and cathartic releasing in relation to parental or sibling, where you've got all these people having releases with fictional memories of their parents. Mine was standing right there. So I'm having these major cathartic releasing about hurts of my childhood, of which were not major, but were still emotions of a childhood experience. And there my parents were right in front of me. So it was really interesting, but it gave me enormous rewards, particularly in being able to speak my truth to my parents as I got older, but also to others. And so that was my early beginnings, which was quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it gave me the gift of having an open mind. Mm-hmm. I was meditating at 8 years old. I was first initiated by gurus at 8 years old, and I was meditating at that age. So I was given an open-mindedness that has been with me forever. And as we were just discussing, my art is an expression of that open-mindedness. And as your viewers won't be able to see, but obviously, Lily, you see the piece of artwork behind me, which is the constellation work. Planets, nebulas, stars. That is me connecting to that open-mindedness that I grew up with, that universal consciousness. And now I paint what I feel and experience when I think or feel about universal consciousness. And this is what comes out. And there are other styles that I do as well. As I said, if you go on to David Arkenstone Barnett, Art and Photography, that was a quick plug, by the way, you will see the different styles of artwork that I have available. In 1985, I arrived in New Zealand. I was living in Israel. Prior to that, I'd gone to Israel. I'd gone back to the UK from Australia. And back in the UK, I was very much immersed in the Arthurian energies and legends. And I did a lot of research into King Arthur, the history of Arthur. I did a lot of visiting to places of Arthurian antiquity, such as Tintagel, Cornwall, places up north of England. I joined the National Trust, which gave me access to the cathedrals and castles and places of national interest in antiquity. And I immersed myself in the legends of Arthur. I then went to Israel because I wanted to immerse myself, ironically, in the energies of Jesus, not from a religious perspective, but from a spiritual perspective. So I visited Jerusalem. I was actually living on a kibbutz for about a year, and I visited Jerusalem, spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. The Dome of the Mount, which is a very, very important place, the Knights Templar, the connection, the first sort of connections of the Holy Grail, the stories of the Grail coming from that particular area. And in later life, when I became a Freemason, of course, that particular location, the Dome of the Mount, is, of course, the original location of Solomon's Temple, which is at the very heart of Freemasonry. So there was sort of circles of completions within circles and so forth as the years went by. But what I did come out with my experiences of being in Israel was that there was a direct connection between King Arthur and Jesus and the Grail and so forth. The Grail not necessarily being a cup, but the Grail being Magdalene herself. And of course, the books that came out, the Da Vinci Code and so forth, and the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was an amazing book written by one of my cousins, Richard Lee. Michael Bagent and Richard Lee wrote Holy Blood, Holy Grail in 1980, and Richard Lee was a cousin of mine. So it sort of runs in the family. But there was a direct link between Arthur and the legends of Arthur and the stories and the legends of Jesus and Magdalene and the disciples. And so visiting these places, I immersed myself in all of those energies, brought these pieces of information together. But when I arrived in New Zealand in 1985, November of 1985, I did something that seemed very unusual to a lot of people, and that is I joined the Navy. And that would seem very oppositional to my beliefs and my upbringings. Excuse me. But if I may just paint a little picture, I was already immersed in the personal development workshops my parents were teaching here in New Zealand at that time. And it was simply that a friend of mine and I were sitting by the Auckland Museum, which is on the lovely mount, on the mount there. You've got the beautiful historic museum for those that have been there. And ironically, the person I was sitting with, who was my dearest friend at the time, and a real brother, if you or your viewers have been to the Saturday Market in Littleton, the Saturday Market where he runs that.
Oh, wow, cool.
Yeah, and he was with me, and today he will still say he remembers this moment in early January of 1986. We were sitting on the grass banks of the museum, having gone into the museum. It was a beautiful summer's afternoon. We were sitting there on the bank looking out towards the Manukau Harbour, or the Waitemata Harbour. And there were the Navy ships were sailing out, the New Zealand Navy ships. There was 3 of them in a row, and they were heading out towards the Hauraki Gulf. And we were watching them in silence, and literally the only way I can explain it is that a voice very loudly said, in my mind, you need to join the Navy. So I turned to him and I said, I'm going to join the Navy. And he looked at me, and the look on his face was, nowadays we say WTF, okay, which I think is a really good abbreviation. He said it out loud. He said, WTF, what are you talking about? you're a spiritual person. Why are you wanting to join a military? And I said, I don't know. All I know is that I need to join. So 2 months later, of March of 1986, I was in the Navy. I was even in the history books, believe it or not. My little claim to fame, if you can call it that, was about a week after I joined the Navy. The commanding officer of the naval base in Tamaki said, he called me up and he brought me into his office, and his words were, how the bloody hell did you get in the Navy? And I said, I joined by applying. And he said, well, we don't know if you can stay. And I said, well, why? He said, because you're on a 6-month working visa on your passport. And I said, yes. He says, well, you need to be a New Zealand citizen. We don't know if you can stay. He said, however, we're going to look into it. We'll get back to you. And about 2 weeks later, he called me up and he said, well, you're not going to believe it, but we actually found in the 1941 Defence Act that a British citizen could join the New Zealand military if on a working visa. It goes back to the formation of the New Zealand Navy in 1941. So he said, you can stay. So it's the first time in military history that a person on a visa got in and was allowed to. Anyway, so I was meant to be there. I'm going to cut this story a little short because it is a lecture in on itself. Mm-hmm. The reason I joined the Navy was because we were going to have an encounter in the end of around about November 1986. We had already been asked, the ship I served on, by the way, which is the HMNZ Southland. The story I'm going to briefly share is now known globally in UAP circles as the Southland event, referring to the ship, the Southland. I went in as a sonarman, so sonar being the detection of submarines and so forth, and that was my specialized qualification. Around about early November 1986, the Ministry of Defence requested the Southland to do something very strange, which was to sail out through the Hauraki Gulf, go out about 10 kilometers, turn around and come back in. But as we were sailing back into the Hauraki Gulf, the sonar controllers, which we were to turn on our sonars and report if any objects followed us back in. So we're talking about under ocean, mm-hmm. Submerged objects. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. This we did for about a few days, about 5 days to 7 days. We just, every now and then we went out and came back in. Sure enough, anything up to 3 submerged objects would follow us back into the Hauraki Gulf. But when we got to roundabout Rangitoto Island, they seemed to disappear. So they never quite followed us into the Hauraki Gulf or into the Waitemata Harbour. So there seemed to be, a location that they would seem to disappear. And this happened for about a week. So that was a very odd, but we did report in that there were objects following us in. We detected them. We then, in about January 1987, we sailed out into the Pacific. The location itself, I'm not 100% certain because we were closed up to what's called defense stations. So we were playing war games with ourselves, really. Mm-hmm. We did have the Australian Navy playing with us for a while, their submarines, and we were hunting them, detecting them and reporting, hey, we've got you. So it was a sort of a war game. Then the subs went back home and we were left by ourselves. We were closed up for defense stations early in the morning, about 1 o'clock in the morning, when our team in the sonar control room I initially detected an object that was following us about 20 kilometers astern. Again, I'm having to make this very succinct because it is a slightly lengthy story, but this object followed us, and every time we tried to shake it off, it would follow us. Every time we sped up and slowed down, it sped up and slowed down, but it always remained 20 kilometers astern. We were able to get a width measurement of it because it was head on with us, and our sonar systems were able to detect it was around about 150 feet wide. Now, if you imagine that a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, US aircraft carrier, is round about 175 feet in width. So it's width. And when you see one of those ships, they are huge. So if you imagine that this object was slightly less wide as a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, that's phenomenal. So we knew we weren't dealing with a conventional submarine because they're not as wide as that. They may be about 50, 60 feet in width, not 150. But because we couldn't get a very good side profile, we didn't quite know how long it was. Not until the captain got woken up and made us do a very, very sharp turn to port. And as you can imagine, if you suddenly turn like that, the object also had to turn to then come behind us again. As it turned, we got a side profile, and it was 800 feet in length. Now, the largest submarine in the world is a Typhoon, Russian Typhoon, which is about 500 to 550 feet in length. This is 800 feet in length by 150 feet wide. So we knew we had something that was unknown. It didn't register any propeller sounds. We were listening in for the sound of propellers. There was nothing. So we knew that this was a non-conventionally driven object. After about 45 minutes of it playing with us, it suddenly went from 20 kilometers and within round about 3 seconds was underneath our ship. As it went underneath the ship lost complete power, totally. And we were left adrift, completely adrift at night in the middle of somewhere in the Pacific. We didn't know exactly where we were. And everything just shut down and everything went dead. So even all the backup batteries that would normally kick in when the main steam turbine generators shut down, nothing came on. So all our emergency lighting with the batteries, independent batteries, everything gone. So we were in pitch black. So after a moment of silence, as I share in my lectures when I talk about this more in depth, we went from hysterical sounds within the sonar control room as this object came screaming up from behind us, and all our sonars that we had trained on it was screaming. Because as you can imagine, when you watch a film, you always hear the sound of the sound going out, and then you hear the blip come back. Well, as an object comes closer and closer, that gets louder and faster and faster and faster and faster. So you go from light splashing and sound screaming to nothing. Absolute blackness and no sound, nothing. I initially thought we had died because there was nothingness and you can't see anything in front of your face because you're in the heart of the ship, and without any light source whatsoever, you cannot see the hand in front of your face, even though we were wearing what's called anti-flash gear, which is the white masks and the white gloves. You could do this and all you'd feel is the air rush past, but you couldn't see it. After a few moments that seemed to go on forever, the sonar controller who sits behind us and observes said, "Is everybody okay?" And then you could hear the exhale of breath as we realized we were actually okay. Next, we had to get all the crew, all 250 crew, out of the ship and onto the flight deck because we're now adrift and we could run aground on a reef. So, excuse me, we had to get into the heart of the ship without any source of light. But in those days, thank goodness, we still had candles and matches. So we lit those. Believe it or not, yes, it was still in the days when you had candles and matches, because none of our torches worked, you see. So all we could hear was the hysterical cries of the crew below deck saying, "What's going on? What's happening? What's happening?" And us getting them out and onto the flight deck. And I remember to my dying day standing on the flight deck in pitch blackness because, of course, there was none of the ship's lights, external lights on. And it was a moonless night, and standing on the flight deck, I looked up, and I say to people that when you normally look up at the night sky, you see quite a vast blackness, and you see the white dots of the stars.
Yeah.
When you take away all known artificial light, it's almost the complete opposite. It's like looking at a silver blanket with a few black dots, because the Milky Way in its entirety, without any artificial light to block it, is exceptional. There are no words to put into the beauty of looking up and seeing a silver sky of stars that just seems to go on forever. And I will never forget the image of looking up and seeing that. And again, my artwork with all the stars is a dedication to that one experience of looking up and seeing an endless sea of stars. So my artwork is a reflection of that moment, you see. So we after an hour or so of being adrift, the engineers managed to get one steam turbine operational, one propeller operational, and we limped back to Wellington, and we had to report this to the Admiralty. They sent in an officer from the Admiralty to speak to us, those that were in the sonar control room. There were 4 of us, and we had to sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, that we wouldn't talk about the event that happened. In 2002, the New Zealand government released all public viewing the UFO files, all the documented UFO reports in New Zealand history in 2002. But you will never read this story that I've just shared with you. It is not in there because it cannot be disclosed because of the sensitivity of it. So from me lecturing about this event, and as I said, I left the Navy and went into the security industry, where I spent the next 33 years. And I ended up being regional and branch manager of some of the biggest national and international security companies. The reason for that was because being in that industry was going to bring me into connection with contracts and people of a military and secure nature that would bring me eventually 6 years ago to Atlantis. And so I had to go into the military. And by the way, after that incident or that experience with the USO, which is what's called an unidentified submerged object, I actually left the Navy. I realized the purpose of why I had to go into the Navy was to have that one experience. I had the experience. I knew that it had changed my life completely. It led me on a completely new pathway, and therefore I left the Navy. But I was already working in the security industry by the time I'd left the Navy. So I then went into the security industry because I was then going to have, years later, experiences, connections, contacts that were going to once again change the direction of my life and ultimately bring me to Atlantis. Wow. So that's, in a nutshell, how I got to Atlantis.
Love it. Love it, love it, love it. Absolutely love it. Interesting that you talk about, objects being underwater. As a little girl, because I come from St Andrews, which is south of Timaru, and my parents' house is over the sea. Mm-hmm. I remember my dad used to get up all nights, all different hours of the night. And I remember him one day, I must have only been 7 or 8. So this is going back possibly, a good 20 years. Him saying that he saw a UFO and it emerged under the water, and he swears by it still to this day that and my dad doesn't lie. So that was as a little girl growing up, and obviously with my gift, because I had my gift, I'm very much aware, that there's outer frequencies, outer dimensions, outer planets, whatever we want to call it, beings in our multiverse.
Oh, absolutely. In all the years and all my researches all over the world, it's brought me knowledge and information and connection with people who have shared knowledge and information that fits into my greater picture, the jigsaw puzzle. Things like people have heard of stories like the Philadelphia experiment and so forth. And so I threw myself into the research of that. And, the Philadelphia experiment on one hand was about cloaking technology to cloak the American warships from enemy radar. But in fact, it was a project that was run by Tesla and Einstein to ultimately put into effect the unified field theory that Einstein did in fact create, which in history they say he never completed his unified field theory, which was basically to create a simple equation that answers the question of all the energies of the universe and how they all fit beautifully together. He did, in fact, complete it, and the application of the unified field theory was the harmonic frequency that allowed Tesla to create the harmonic generators that could literally be a key to open up the doors between multi-dimension. And from that application, a host of new beings and extraterrestrials and races were able to be connected to. Prior to that, humans were involved and connected to beings and extraterrestrials from within the confines of this universe. But then you suddenly had connection with multi-dimensional beings from multi-universes. And so the Philadelphia experiment has and the way I'd say it, if I may, we have a history that we all grew up with. We grew up that the pyramids were tombs to the pharaohs. No, they weren't.
No.
We grew up with man landed on the moon. Well, not quite. So.
No.
And so there is a historical platform that runs along a line, and that is the history that we've all grown up with. And to a time, we accepted it. But running parallel and juxtably with that history is what I call the true history. Okay, and it's underneath. I say it's underneath. It could be in any direction the way you want it, but it runs parallel to this history that we were brought up with, and it explains a lot more. No, the pyramids were not, in fact, tombs. The only reason why Egyptologists say it was a tomb was because of one cartouche that exists within the Great Pyramid, and it says one word, Cheops, or Khufu. It's the same person, by the way. And from that, they have stated, we found a sarcophagus in the heart of the pyramid. It's not a sarcophagus. And because of that cartouche that says Khufu, this is in fact the burial tomb of the great pharaoh Khufu. No, it wasn't. It was saying who built the great pyramids of the Giza Plateau. It was Khufu. And in fact, if you want to take it back further to the subject we're talking about, Khufu had another name in history, Thoth. Thoth, the Atlantean. The great priest scribe of Atlantis was Thoth. Thoth became Khufu. In Greek mythology, he became Hermes. And that's why there's the great connection of the great statue of Hermes. They found buried in a chamber the emerald tablets. The emerald tablets, the word of Thoth. So here you have the connection. So pyramids were in fact not a tomb. They were built by Khufu. So you can see why we are brought up with a history, and we believe it because we don't know anything else until you become a researcher and discover there's a lot more going on. But going back to what you were saying with your father, yes, the majority of, a lot more of the UFO sightings have actually come from the depths of the ocean, more so than even aerial. Okay, so that's a very interesting perspective, and a lot of people, yes, definitely have said that their experience of sightings have come from beneath. In fact, in 2015, the United States military finally acknowledged the existence of UFOs or UAPs by the release of the Nimitz videos of the cockpits from aircraft launched from the USS Nimitz. And I was actually on a conference with the radar, the chief radar plotter, who was the first person on the Nimitz to identify or find these objects and then direct those aircraft to the location of where these objects, which are known as Tic Tacs. They were known as the Tic Tacs because they were the shape and little white objects, and they look just like a Tic Tac. But the incredible thing is that he was plotting them on radar, and I think he found them at about 60,000 feet. And within about 5 seconds, they dropped down to 50 feet above the ocean. Okay? When the fighters that were deployed to intercept these Tic Tacs saw them, they had actually gone under the ocean, and they could see them just under the ocean. So again, there are these objects that once again plummet down into the depths of the ocean. So I can say categorically to the people listening that there is far more going on in our oceans than you could ever imagine. Totally. Yeah.
So, Atlantis, I know that your work now is very, you focus on Atlantis rising.
Yeah.
For the listeners, what would you like to share around that? Because obviously everyone has a different idea of Atlantis and obviously how it was destroyed. If it was destroyed, where we're heading.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Again, I'm going to make this as succinct as possible because I normally do a minimum 2-hour lecture on the subject. You can bring in so much more information. I think I've had the wonderful experience over the years to meet people from all over the world who have, at times without even knowing why, this beautiful connection to this word Atlantis. And when I say a word, I've literally, and I use the example, it was a few years ago, I was sitting, it was one evening watching TV, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and from my phone bleeped, and it was a message on Messenger, and it was a young lady in London who, because of the time difference, she had just woken up. And she had woken up with the word Atlantis still hanging in her consciousness. She had no idea about what Atlantis was. She had done no research into Atlantis. All she knew was that she'd woken up with the word Atlantis. She got out of bed, and these are her words. She got out of bed, went straight to her laptop, typed in Atlantis into Google, and my name came up in the search bar. She clicked my name, went to Atlantis Rising, saw my phone number, and sent me a message saying, I've been drawn to connect with you because I've just woken up. So we ended up having, I think it was about an hour and a half's conversation. And I was directing her to my research and so forth, and who did she feel she was, what was the connection, etc., etc. Now, that's just one example of the connections I have with people who, out of the blue, from all over the world, will be having a feeling sense of this energy called Atlantis, but they don't know much about it. Mm-hmm. If they do know something about it, then they have been brought up once again with the mythology, the myths of Atlantis, which is, yes, that it was an extraordinary culture and civilization that at its height became corrupt, and due to its corruption brought about its own demise, and Atlantis sank beneath the waves. Now that is what I call the sort of the romantic version of the history. It's the same. It could be the same book on the bookshelf that goes with the stories of King Arthur, which are very much, the Knights of the Round Table, Lancelot, Guinevere, Excalibur, Camelot, Merlin, or Robin Hood. They're these great pieces of literature that seem to direct us to some historical event or person or persons, but we don't quite know if it was for real, because there's not a lot of information that can actually say with concrete evidence, like, okay, we know Alfred the Great existed. He was the forefather of the creator of the modern United Kingdom. We know he exists because A, B, and C. Atlantis, the only information really that came about was Plato's conversation and what were called the Criterius monologues, which was simply a written version of conversations that Plato had with his friends about the world events. Not too dissimilar to what we're doing now. We're discussing world events and our backgrounds of information and our passions and blah, blah, blah. And in the Critias monologues is Plato first speaking about this culture called Atlantis. But of course, in there, the Platonic information is that I just described, that it was a superior culture that actually had a war with Athens and got their butts kicked to the Atlanteans. But it seems very patchy and so forth. But it's the only information that we actually have. And yet from that, there was a Vesuvius of books and movies and literature and so forth that came from it. And Atlantis, as always, it is, and I do have this, I do ask people who come to my lectures this very fundamental question. I say, when you think or feel about Atlantis, where do you think it is on the globe? Where do you think it is? So, Lily, if I asked you this as a hypothetical question, where do you feel Atlantis was located?
Actually, I want to say Mexico.
Mexico, yeah. Mexico, the center of the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, off the east coast and the west coast of the United States, in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle, off the Mediterranean, off Athens, off Greece, off here, off there. And I have a multitude of answers that come from the people who are at the lectures. Do you know what my answer is? And this is the part that they sit back and think, what? I say, and guess what? You are all correct. All of you are correct. And that's what suddenly stumps them. They say, well, what do you mean? We're all correct. And I say to them, because Atlantis was a global culture. It wasn't just one location. It was global. Mm. And it then answers the question that a lot of people sometimes will ask, which is, at some point they say, how come we have ancient architect that seems to be the same, but in different countries? How come we seem to have pyramids that seem to follow a same design, architect, shape, connection between weight and measurement of the earth, and yet they're in different countries, separated by space, location, but seem to have a similarity between them? How come we have architects in temples and walls, these enormous walls that have been built with blocks that fit together with laser precision that engineers today can still marvel at? How come we have these same designs all over the world, and yet our historians are telling us, oh, that's just by coincidence? No, it isn't. The designs are the same because it came from a fundamental source, that being the Atlantean culture. Okay. Mm-hmm. Historians even now are at least acknowledging that Atlantis, at the time of its end, and I'm going to talk about what brought everything to an end, they had already, they acknowledged that they had gone global. They were a global culture. But, and there is a but, there was indeed a central governing location, the heart of Atlantis, and yes, that did have a central location. But the Atlantean culture, its beliefs, its spiritual beliefs, its technologies, its methodologies were global. A little bit like, I'm from England, the British Empire at one stage covered 28 to 30% of the Earth's surface with the empire. Mm-hmm. Now, if you were a visiting being from another world and you landed in India at that time, you would be forgiven to believe that this was England, because you would see English people, you would see that they were speaking English, their governing laws were English, their culture was based upon, and you'd say, oh, this must be England. The answer would be, no, it's India. Well, what do you mean? Okay, and then they take themselves off and they go and visit parts of Africa. Oh, this must be England, because you're speaking English, you are governed by the... No, you say, this is not. This is Africa. But what we can tell you is that there is a governing location in a country called England, and more so in a place called London, and that's where the seat of government comes from, a place called London. So Atlantis indeed had a central location, and that's what we're discussing here. Where was that central location and what happened to it? So when I meet people, they're talking to me because they have started to have an awakening, in particular in relation to Atlantis, the Atlantean culture, and they want to understand more about what part they play in that. And that is the subject then when people come to the lectures, is to get greater understanding. Now, we can go back further and even talk about Lemuria, but the differences between Lemuria and Atlantis, in my experience, and by the way, everything I'm sharing is based on my experiences only, what I have observed, what I have gained in information, but these are my experiences. I'm sharing me. Okay, so I just want to sort of paint that picture straight away. We speak very clearly about Lemuria, and if you are New Age-y, you all know the word Lemuria. But in my humble experience, there is almost no literature and information about Lemuria. But whereas at least with Atlantis, there's a little bit of something that we have as a document, whether it be the Plato Craterus or the Emerald Tablets, which were found, the writings of Atlantis by Thoth, we do have a foundation to build upon. So that's why I think I was so much more connected to the Atlantis, was because it gave me a foundation to work on and work with. So the people that I talk to, the people that I connect with, are also having these connections and want to know more about the culture, the history, what happened, and ultimately what part they play in the emerging energy, which, by the way, I feel is a combination of the Lemurian and the Atlantean energies. Okay? I just want to say that it is not exclusive. It is a combination of these incredibly powerful fundamental energies from both these ancient, beautiful cultures. So I just wanted to also say that.